And the moderator would be Professor Leo Dahan, Director of ISS. And let me introduce you to the panelists. We have 3 panelists. The first one is Dr. Wendy Harcourt. She is on the faculty of the ISS, and Wendy is also a feminist researcher and activist and chief editor of the quarterly journal Development. She received the 2010 Feminist and Women's Studies Association's prize for her book on body politics in development, Critical Debates in Gender and Development. The book was published in 2009. And her other publications include an edited collection with Arturo Escobar on Women and Politics of Place, published in 2005. She has written extensively on alternatives to development, sexual and reproductive rights, environment, globalization from a gender perspective. Wendy Harcourt is sitting over there. And the next panelist is Dr. Rosalba Icaza Garza. She holds a PhD and MA in Politics and International Studies from the University of Warwick, and BA in International Relations from Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City. She is interested in the application of action research methodologies in her teaching and research, and committed to facilitating spaces for mutual learning between practitioners and academics. Third World and Decolonial Feminist Theories, Modernity, Coloniality, Decoloniality, Collective Thinking, and Theories on Social Resistance to Global and Regional Governance have captured her attention too. And the last panelist would be Professor Mohammed Salih. He is the Deputy Rector of Research Affairs of the ISS, and he obtained his PhD in Economics and Social Science, University of Manchester, UK. Mohammed is Professor of Politics of Development at the Institute of Social Studies, The Hague, and the Department of Political Science at University of Leiden in the Netherlands. And his area of interest is Africa and Middle East, and shortly in the English-speaking Caribbean. The area of Mohammed's major publications are Politics of Development, Sustainable Development, Theories and Applications of Governance, Conflict Studies, Political Institutions, Parliaments, Political Parties, and Democracy Development Interfaces. I will give the floor to Professor Leo Dahan as the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, can you hear me? Yes, you can. We'll take time till 12:30 to discuss tomorrow's this morning's key lecture. I would like to thank Professor Frederik Apfel once again for her lecture. It was a very, how would you say, dense lecture, and then we might be able here to comment a bit on that. See also how we can continue the discussion. Now I'm going to ask the panelists first, of course, for their opinion, and then Professor Apfel for a short reply. Then we'll look at you for questions and comments, of course. Now I think the interaction with the room is most important, with the audience is most important. So the panelists are here to, how would you say, start the debate, fuel the debate. So I will ask them to explain their argument, but not to take too long. I can't limit them in time, of course, because I don't know how much time they need for developing their arguments. Sometimes you really need a bit of time to do that and to come up with a decent reply to this very interesting lecture. So thank you again, Professor Apfel, and let's see what our colleagues have in mind as a comment. I would like to start with Professor Salih, and that is because I expect him to come up with the most, how would you say, common sense arguments. Then I would ask Dr. Icaza to continue, and I ask Dr. Wendy Harcourt to how would you say, more or less also take together the previous comments and bring it further. Professor Salih.
Okay.
Mohammed, I would say.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to thank Frederik for this very interesting. Okay. I think this is a very interesting lecture, which also takes us to some very important issues on the current debate on environment and the environmental crisis and issues of ecology and all of that. But if you may allow me just for a minute to to give you a simpler understanding of this lecture, because I think it is very heavy for some of us who are not very well versed in this area, and it's not also an area with specialization in that. The argument that she raised is very well known in the terrain of environmental philosophy, where there are a number of schools, and I think she has not mentioned that. She just concentrated on her own work and what she wanted to do this morning. And of course, we know the work by biocentriscists, bioregionalists, the work of Earth First and their extreme Earth Firsters, the work by deep ecologists, and also various other schools of environmental philosophy. The idea here is very simple, based on 4 ideas. And those 4 ideas is a critique on the materialist way in which the relationship between humans and environment were constructed. And these 4 ideas are built in contrast. For instance, those philosophical ecologists have 4 major ideas. First idea is that they reject the idea of hierarchy, which means that putting human beings at the apex of creation. They don't call us human beings, they call us the human animal. And see in her way that you talk about the cosmic world that also transcends us as humans to be much more encompassing and much more holistic in its understanding. The second idea is integration versus separation. And you can see in the way she deals with the idea of nature, human beings, environment, we are only part of the environment, you cannot be separated for it. And of course, she used a very difficult argument by reference, of course, to quantum science and the latest debate in which shows that, in fact, science itself is as much as subjective as social sciences, and also to have an argument that, in fact, the idea that science is completely separated from natural science, completely separated from social science, of course, is not true, because there is a unity between the object of observation and the observer, or the subject and the object. The third idea that she has is the idea of continuum or continuity. That is versus the idea of dichotomy, dichotomizing this and that. The fourth and the last one is the whole idea of cosmic holism versus the idea of atomistic, mechanistic understanding of the world. And I can see her argument when she started with the critique of economics. Of course, she started with the critique of all the first part of this, the hierarchy versus hierarchy, separation, dichotomy, and atomistic and mechanistic understanding of the relationship that are created. Now, to me, this argument is very important because once you separate between the object and subject of study, you immediately also make the object of study becomes something that is, you have a utilitarian viewpoint on that, you are using it because it is not part of you. And to put it in a much more simpler language is that once that separation also making harm, quote unquote, in terms of environmental damage and all of that, much easier to understand and much easier to absorb. And also become also normalized and become part of the way you think about nature. Now, to me, all of that, I have no problem with that. I think we can understand the whole idea of not to separate between the object and the subject and all the other implications of that. The 2 questions that I have in mind is number 1, how can we imagine a world in which some of the assumptions, for instance, of economics, I'm not a big fan of that. I did it as an undergraduate, also in my graduate studies. It is not rejecting the assumptions of it, but if the assumptions of economic imply certain democratic principles, the principle that individual preferences somehow become very important. How can we deal with this in ecological democracy, whereby individuals were explicitly asked to submit all of those freedoms to a bigger cause, that is a collective cause, the cause of saving the environment? And how can that understanding be, for instance, vis-a-vis societies that enjoy a level of material comfort somehow. There are far less diseases. There are much ways of resolving some of the constraints also imposed on us by the environment. How do we, for instance, operationalize an ecological democracy in a world that is characteristically the way that Frederick has described? Is it really, to use a bad economic language, is it really command and control, which is used by economists as one way of resolving some of those problems? How does this ecological democracy looks like? And for me as an individual would have certain preferences in the way that I want to live and I want to do things. How do I manage that? And I think this is a very important question that is there. The second question is it that the economists were able to understand something that is essential in human behavior, and they developed their science in order to respond to that? Or is it that we, as human beings, using a Hobbesian notion of that, of Levitian, that we are destructive by nature, and we are conflict-ridden, not only vis-a-vis each other, but also vis-a-vis the planet in which we live? And therefore, what is needed is to get rid of the economics in order for us to redeem ourselves from its vigorousness? Or is it the other way around? There is something wrong with our own human nature that is anthropocentric vis-a-vis the environment, and how can we deal with that? I think there are two different ways, and how to operationalize that also becomes to me much more problematic. The philosophy of it, I have no problem with it, how to problematize it and how to bring it to practice in terms of dichotomies, but also in terms of ecological democracy. I would like to know more about that, and whether what is wrong is the economics, or what is wrong us human beings being destructive, and which one to be corrected or to be acted upon in order to save the environment and for us to create a cosmocentric economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that brings indeed two sharp questions to the fore. Rosalba. Use this one.
Well, I have some comments and 4 questions, but of course I'm posing the questions with the spirit of see what we can discuss from them. I am very interested on the implications that you were constantly saying to us, that questioning the Western canon of science, like in the way you presented and the way you share some authors are doing it. I can immediately think in many of the implications for, of course, the way we define development, change, our role as academics and practitioners. But of course, I also see implications for the role of science and how science is very much entangled in a geopolitics of knowledge. So I really would like if you could elaborate a little bit more some of the implications of this power, this struggle for power and recognition that is also very central in the world in which we are now, that is the academic world. This is my first question, comment that I will ask you to elaborate on. The second reflection that I'm very interested about is what you say about the notion of regeneration. And you mentioned very briefly on how your notion is based upon the idea of cyclical or spiral ideas of life and death. Of course, I would like if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, because there was no time for that. But I would also to ask you to share with us, if it's possible, what you have to silence in yourself as a Western academic in order to see this. So in very basic terms, I'm asking you to be more explicit about your own epistemology, because I think that this is very important, the way you have been knowing and learning that actually has bring you to the, this reflection that we need to understand in a cyclical or a spiral way the notion of what we have been understanding as development. This takes me to a third comment and question. We are normally assuming that what defines human nature is this conflictive nature that Professor Sally was making reference to. And this is very much, as we know, based on a modern philosophy based on Hobbes, for example. In the post-colonial tradition, there has been a lot of challenges. And I'm thinking right now, for example, the word of Robbie Shilliam. I don't know if you're familiarized with it. He's a New Zealander academic working with indigenous groups there in order to question this idea of conflict-driven nature and how this idea of conflict-driven nature is actually based on very Western modern ideas of possessive accumulation. It also dovetails with the questions of scarcity that you were talking about. And what this scholar is putting as an alternative to think about land tenure, issues of indigenous rights to land, is the notion of a stewardship. And he's actually working on this concept as an alternative to the idea of land titling, for example. I would like to ask you if from your point of view, of your proposal of looking in the way you are presenting us ecology and development, this notion of a stewardship as something different that could be communal in most of the cases is an alternative from your perspective. And finally, I would like to ask you something I'm thinking how to put it in concrete and more clear ways. But we hear about this dominant gaze that separates the object and the subject of when we interpretate and reinterpretate reality that is supposed to be outside. My question is very abstract, but I think that it has many implications, especially for most of the audience that is or doing a PhD, is what we need to acquire as social scientists to be able to challenge this dominant gaze. In more abstract terms will be, is there really an externality to our modern gaze? Can we actually do it? And if we can do it, which are the tools that you have employed to do it? So it's very much related to the first one. But I think that we need to think if there is a possibility of this exteriority to modernity in order to see that our gaze is a dominant gaze and is not necessarily an universal gaze. From the perspective of decoloniality, that is a philosophy and a proposal to challenge this dominant gaze, people is talking about border thinking. That is not necessarily external, but is not necessarily internal to modernity. And people is looking into this border thinking or identifying this border thinking and border epistemologies precisely in the communities that you were talking to us today in your work, in your daily work in Peru. So if you could elaborate a little bit on that, are we on a position to step out from our privileges and actually see that dominant gaze and dismantling it? What does this entail? These are basically my questions.
Thank you very much, Rosalba. If Professor Apfel can still wait a little bit with her answers, then we'll go to Wendy Harcourt first.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to the PhD students for organising this session, and also to Frédéric for really a very stimulating and indeed very dense start to these dialogues. I wanted to say that it is indeed also a privilege for me because we both started these dialogues in, I think, 1993, when we were looking at greening the economies. And indeed, some of the words you've just mentioned, Rosalba, like stewardship, those were the terms people were using. And what are we now, almost 20 years later? We're still struggling with many of the similar ideas around dominant knowledges, other cosmologies. How can you bring in practical knowledge into the, sort of high theory science? So I think in terms of the histories, it's a bit worrying that we're still here having these debates. On the other hand, I can see in your working through of very many different knowledges. In fact, you have really moved through, and I very much appreciate Rosalba asking for you to share some of those methodologies and that self-knowledge that you've come to. And indeed, I would also really appreciate that you do go into what Mohammed has talked about, which is operational ecological democracy, because I think here in ISS we're doing development studies and we're really trying to understand how to put all of this knowledge into practice. And it's wonderful to hear these sorts of debates at a very high level, I would say, but then how do you bring it down to the ground? And I'm very conscious as somebody sort of moving into doing more academic work that is one of the gaps. So that, I think, is a challenge for the work that you're presenting. And it's a very important challenge right now. You mentioned Steve Marglin's work, The Dismal Science, the book that came out in 2008. Now, all of you know 2008 was really a time of crisis, food crisis, climate crisis, many different senses of the financial system collapsing. So it's very important that when we do give these very interesting philosophical understandings, we have to also relate it to that politics. So I'd be very interested if you could try to do that. Not only, okay, Steve Marglin's work is fairly clear, he's addressing economists, but I think also your work is very clearly addressing the great interest now in Buen Vivir and cosmologies that has come up indeed in relation to greening the economy. With the Rio +20 debates, I think it's a very interesting moment that you're coming forward talking about these things with your long experience, but how could you relate that to, let's say, people who are struggling to find alternatives to economics and to development, bringing on board nature? So I would like to hear your comments on that. Secondly, I would be, this is really my own interest, wanting to hear a little bit more about your voice as a feminist speaking through these others in order to be heard. I was very conscious, and if you forgive me, you're talking with someone through Steve Marglin, who you have known and worked with, indeed lived with for many years, and it really struck me, where is your voice in that? And I'm asking you because I think it's a strategy and an interesting one to bring out, is how to find your voice via the sciences, via the knowledges. But I'm also asking you, okay, where is your voice and where do you really situate yourself? And to give you a chance to do that. I think you sort of had to skip over some of that, so it's a chance for you to explore that with us. And I think that's extremely important, again, for all of us thinking about doing our own work. We have to keep our own voices. So while referring to the greats before us, how do we interact with them? How do we weave in our stories? And I think those sorts of exposures or being clear that that's what we're doing is very helpful, particularly as we're all struggling with very similar things. But we need to also have our own voice, I think, as we do that. And particularly your voice, which is so clear and important with all those histories. And I hope you forgive me for mentioning it, but I think it is important. And then lastly, this is perhaps my voice, as I'm really interested in how do you make the connections between the sort of eco-feminist discussions, which you actually don't mention, which I think are struggling with some of those similar things, whether it's from a misplaced understanding of nature or whatever. I think, though, they have, particularly people like Vandana Shiva, who I know has come here in the past, they really appeal to people.
No, so I didn't say anything.
Well, to some people, well, okay, good. To some people, she really reaches out and people hear her in ways which I think are very important. So that, for example, she was in Rio speaking, being heard. Just one example, there are others. But I think it would be interesting for me to hear where you come out on what is the eco-feminist perspective, because I think there's a real appeal there to, let's say, popular knowledge, perhaps politically popular knowledge, which I think it's important to link up with your own work around particularly reciprocity, but also cosmologies. And then lastly, also the issue around technologies, because I think that's another really important issue that ecofeminists are struggling with, and that's similar to sciences, but maybe you have something else to add. I know that's putting a huge amount on your plate, but that's just to say how stimulating and how important your paper was, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. Yes, and that's indeed, those are indeed many comments, but there is also a way to focus them. If we, in front of us are mainly PhD researchers, some of them really struggling with the questions you posed. For others it might be marginal, but for all it is of interest to see how this discussion can be best linked to their actual research undertakings. And I think if we keep that in mind, then our discussion that might go into various directions might still be very, how would you say, useful for you. Professor Apfel.
Is this working? Yes. Well, where to start? If I may be allowed to reverse the order of my responses to the order in which, because I believe that Professor Mohammed, your last name I didn't quite. Salim, is the most, for me, the most challenging and difficult, so it gives me more time to think about it. So let me start with Wendy's questions. Now, how to bring, let me start with what I have here as the first one, how to bring it all to the ground. Well, you know, I laugh because, in fact, for me, it was from the ground up, and it's especially now. I retired early after my last child graduated from college, so we didn't need so much money. I was itching to get out of academia, and had the opportunity to do my own thing, which is what I do now. And so what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis is actually literally hands in the dirt. I mean, quite literally. These pictures, I was part of that ceremony. I planted with the tacarpo. You know, that's how on the ground I am in my daily work. So, you know, these kinds of writing is because that's what I've been doing. And it depends on the audience, of course. So for me, and here it goes with, I forgot whether it's Rosalba or Wendy's question, my own journey. Because my own journey, all of this happened through experience, through personal experience. And I, you know, learned, I mean, it was important for me. I didn't do it just because that's what academics do. It was important for me that I could make a rational argument that could be convincing to peers or for what I had learned in a completely different way, in a non-rational, non-academic, in a profoundly experiential way. It was important to me, and I thought, you know, some people are reached in that mode, including me, part of me, my left brain, and some people are reached some other mode, and I think we need both. You know, the left brain is needed. What the left brain does is indispensable. It just shouldn't be dominant. That's, I agree with McKilchrist, obviously. You can see why. But it nevertheless is totally necessary. So, very briefly, as I mentioned, I was born in France, but I was raised in Morocco. So that immediately my, and I was raised in Tangier, which was then an international city, multicultural, multi-religious. From my home, I saw the minaret. I heard the call to prayer regularly, Ramadan, and these were the rhythms. On the other side of the house, I was above the Spanish cathedral and with their processions publicly. And on another side, I oversaw the very, very, very ancient Jewish cemetery. There have been Jews there since the Phoenician came, when the first temple was destroyed, you know, in 500 something, 80 BCE. So these four actually, and in the market where I would often go with my mother every day to buy, the produce was brought in by the Amazigh, known more commonly then as the Berbers, that is the indigenous people of North Africa and of this region, who grew the food and looked completely different, acted completely different, had quite a different culture, even though they were Muslims as well. So you had the urban Arabic Muslim religion and culture, the Amazigh culture, the Jewish, and among the Jews you had two. You had the old ones who had always been there, and then you had the people expelled from Spain, and then European, of which the oldest were the Spanish, but you had a lot of different kinds of Europeans and a lot of French because of the protectorate. So that was a formative experience. Formative experience in a very experiential way, through the legends my our Arabic maid used to tell me all these stories that fascinated me, and the way where she took me, and how the world she showed me, and you know, living in that atmosphere, discovering through my best friend, who was the son of a leader of the independence movement, you know, racism and colonialism, and reacting to it. So there was that. And then there were my years in India, which started not as an anthropologist, but I went there as a wife and as a dancer, and I learned Indian dance, or one type of Indian dance, and this was my first research. And I realized much, much later that my different experience and how I was transformed, I was personally deeply transformed by my years in India. The groundwork was laid by the dance, unknown to me. It was working on my cellular body. And the body is not res extensa, as Monsieur Descartes told us, but the body, like the non-human world, has knowledge and understanding. And I lived it because I finally realized, well, I knew things, not in my head, but I knew, and that's what enabled me to see and be transformed. It's a long story. And then my experience in Peru, in which clearly the most dramatic transformations were through ingesting plants. Master plants, teacher plants, sacred plants. And I was absolutely not a druggie. I was very square and straight in my, in my young age. And so this is not why I did it. I did it because I worked with people who did it, and I participated with them. And this was profoundly transformative. And tell you, there's nothing like participating in an ayahuasca ceremony or going on a retreat in the forest fasting and taking plants, teacher plants. And the experiences you have, they are at the antipodes of rationality. The antipodes. There's nothing in common. And they reveal you things that, they don't reveal it. It's not like being taught, because it bypasses the rational mind. But I was shown things that were so true, so deep, and so transformative for me. Worth 20 years of psychotherapy, better, in a few seconds, just like that, you know. And when the shaman said, I learned all this from the plant told me, oh, you think they're speaking metaphorically. Well, they're not. They're speaking literally. So all of these experiences, and I'm just touching on the highlights, are what really transformed me from, you know, from not being the daughter, the recipient of my parents' heritage, far from it. And that's primary. That's primary. But I was enough of a person of my class, ethnicity, and time that I needed, and it's almost a confession, I needed to make this, translate it all in the kind of talk I gave today, or the book, Subversive Spirituality, is my other work. I needed to do that. But I could never, and I have never written academically about these experiences I just talked to you about. Never. I hope to, but I have to learn a different way of writing, a completely different way of writing, a right brain way of writing, a non-Western way of writing. I don't know. So that's about the thing about using Steve as, you know, actually the dismal science is the product of our collaboration, you know, and he says, you know, he acknowledges me in the preface. So it went both ways. He sharpened my left brain, and I sharpened his right brain, which was pretty dormant. I mean, if you want to talk in those terms, you can talk in some other terms. My voice, and I'm surprised, you know, I use his book just to show that, and we've had these discussions, Steve and I. He can't go there that the non-human world has agency and sentience. He just can't go there, you know. I don't ask him to go. He just can't go. You know, that's his limit. And how far he's gone, given that when I met him, he was a neoclassical economist, is huge. Okay, he's made a huge and paid a huge price, as you can well suspect, professional price for doing this. So you know, I'm kind of continuing a conversation and using it because I all of a sudden became aware. We were actually at the Simchat Bat of our new granddaughter, just born, of our daughter together. We're not together, we're divorced. And we picked up our intellectual conversation, and just as he was, you know, I was asking him, can you state again your how did you get to those 4 assumptions? And in saying this, I just realized that in fact, they all can be traced back to the anthropocentric assumption, which of course remains invisible for Steve. So I thought, you know, I'd bring that because it's a very recent thing. But my own voice is very much, you know, wanting to use biocultural regeneration instead of development, the cosmocentric economy. That's totally me, you know. And I brought in the pictures at the end because I can't separate these ideas, which are very abstract and theoretical, from what I'm doing. That's where they came from. That's where they came from. And also, I didn't have a chance to read everything at the end because I ran out of time, that these practices, I mean, in India, they are not indigenous people. The ones I worked with were peasants, caste society peasants. They do the same ritual. It's the same attitude. And I studied, my second period of fieldwork was focused on the biggest festival of all the peasant castes in all of rural Orissa. And it happens to be the ritual of the menstruation of the earth goddess and of the sea. And it's done equally by men and women, by the way. It's equally important. It's a regenerative ritual once a year. So peasants, I mean, in my experience, the little experience growing up in Morocco, Tangier, the Amazigh people did offerings. The caste Hindus and the tribals, because I've visited them and I've read about them in India, do that. The indigenous people throughout the Americas do that. And from my cross-cultural teaching in anthropology, I have not yet to read about a society that doesn't do that. Okay? So, to borrow a phrase from my friend Gustavo Esteva, they are probably a social majority. We forget that. It's a social majority of the world. The elites in the global south see that, certainly it's true in India, it's true in Peru, it's true in Morocco, see that as what the dominant knowledge system and education institution teach, that this is passé, this is archaic, this is in the past, this is superstitious, it's not real. And that assumption is, even in anthropology, fairly dominant. The spirits don't really exist. I mean, anthropology shows how the spirit represents, depending on the theoretical bent of the anthropologist, the semiotic system, the political system, the economic system, the base, the superstructure, you name it, right? But it represents something else. They don't really exist. And when I say they really exist, oh, she's gone native, which is an absolute taboo among anthropologists. You can't go native. So, or she's romantic. So I got tired of that. And I said, I'm going to use your own, you dominant people, your own big voices to make my argument.
Professor Appel, would you mind if I interrupt you here?
Yes, absolutely.
And have a look at our audience and our PhD researchers and see whether they would agree with you, whether you are going native or are too romantic, or the reverse. Do you feel inspired? Do you see ways, or are you actually working on ways to include this in your research? Are you sometimes working with your right brain instead of your left? Well, that is, of course, a very clear-cut operationalization. May I have comments from the audience?
No, I'm glad.
I would like, I'm sorry, but I prefer the younger generation to speak out first, while I'm an oldie and that colleague over there, and so then please the younger generation first, yes?
I think
one question, two questions.
Who's first?
Three. I'm...
Who's first? Oh, okay.
Hi, good morning. I'm Mariana Corrado from Brazil. I'm a PhD student from the ISS. I found it very, very exciting, your speech, and I think it's great to start the development dialogue from week with this kind of discussion and very critical debate. I have kind of question to you. It seems that there is, also based on the comments of the panelists, there's this, to me, this impression of a dichotomy in different views of the world, that it's either native or Western, or it's either underdeveloped or developed. That's very clear. I understand that it's part of building up an argument,
But I'd like to touch the possibility of having some gray areas or transitional points, if you like, within market dynamics, because these are the predominant dynamics. Could it be possible to think of endogenous change from the heart of the capitalist system? For instance, and this is based on my own research on entrepreneurship, there are many people starting market-based businesses, but with a very strong ecological concern. There's this kind of underlying mindset of exchanging something with the environment, of not using fertilizers, but using waste of production for ecological fertilization and respecting seasonality and things like that. So to what extent our technology, all the technology that has been produced by universities and by the market itself and other institutions, research in general, how can technology be used for regeneration and cosmocentric economy? How do you see this? Is it possible? Is it a kind of illusion? Is it something that cannot be really combined, can't be complementary? How do you see that?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely question.
Shall we take a few questions in a row? Would you prefer to?
No, one by one.
Okay,
I
one
won't
by
remember. Sorry, my age.
This is your pleasure.
So sorry. Very briefly, I'm an optimist, and I see things happening, and I think it's more likely to happen from the core areas of the capitalist world, because in the non-core areas, there's a tremendous seduction of modernity, and I am not one to say you should not want these things. I have them. How can I say you should not want them? Absolutely. And the communities I work with, this project is of course for food sovereignty, but I don't say you shouldn't plant cash crops, cacao, coffee, sachenji, whatever is cash. No, I will help them to do it in the most productive, organic way. Absolutely, and I also know that there's a lot happening, much more happening, it seems to me, although it's very, it's not a very well-informed impression, that there's a lot of interesting things happening from the entrepreneurial, the business sector. There are all kinds of wonderful, interesting things happen. And so my answer to you is yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, I do what I do, in the presentation that I did, you go for the core and the heart of the problem, and that's what I went, and I go for it, right? But on the ground, things are going to change and are changing. There's plenty happening, including what myself I'm doing in the high Amazon. And by the way, this new, very old but rediscovered soil can be adapted to temperate climate. It's a solution for everywhere, adapting it to the locality. So yes, I think very interesting things are happening all over the place.
Thank you very much. There was a second question here in front. Yeah?
Thank you very much, Professor, for your conference. For me, it was very interesting also. It shows us, I think, kind of challenges to researchers that we are experiencing as you, this way of being in the midst of theoretical issues and experience and experiential knowledges, no? And how to write and how to understand and how to put everything together in this way of scientific knowledge, but also in this way of a completely different way to build the knowledge from the women from young people from our positionality. So it was very challenging for me, your conference. I have a question that is, so you were talking about development and then how to go towards this concept of biocultural regenerative. And you talk about complementarity, and Professor Salih talk about integration. I am wondering how we can see these two concepts, these two epistemological positions as complementarities or as a integrative perspective. How to stop fighting because this is development or this is post-development or this is another new concept. And what are the challenges of these new concepts and experiences of whatever, I don't know, development or not, because now we are going to get a PhD in development studies. And I say, oh, no, we have to solve this big issue. But how to go further? That's this dichotomical analysis. And what are the challenges also according to gendered and generational positions in this new way of things, development? So this is my question.
Thank you. Well, let's see. Yes. Well, the challenges are many, and I think the greatest challenge, and this is part of what I did not address in the first question, would be the cosmocentric economy enactments, which, and I think these are key. These are key for going in a different direction. Many people do them, and maybe even a social majority in the world do them, but the dominant part of the society, you know, at best, if their grandparents are still alive and they want you to participate, you will do it out of politeness, but you don't believe a word of it, and you're not going to do it. That is what goes most against the grain. And I worked very hard to put this in a non-religious, non-spiritual language, because it is seen at first blush as a spiritual activity. You know, you're talking to the spirits, you're doing rituals, you're offering. And I try to, through this you know, the quantum work of Bohr and Barad, try to show that these spirits are not imaginary, but to look at them differently, and not look at them mainly as a spiritual activity, but mainly as an economic activity. Because it is, and as a regenerative activity. You see, when you take something from the world, if you do not make a gesture to return something so that you don't deplete it, then it leads, you're not changing your way of acting and thinking about the non-human world. So we need to begin to change that, and that's going to be the hardest. Or perhaps not so hard. I mean, it's hard for certain people, certainly for academics. It's absolutely a no-no in academia. You can't do that. You're immediately tarred with the epithet of New Age. And then your academic reputation is absolutely zilch. That might be why I go to all the big names, you know, to show them that I know my stuff. I'm not a New Age person. You know, it's very challenging. It's very challenging. But the good part is that they're well alive. They're alive and well. And my experience with Pratek, the NGO that invited me to Peru to start with, they taught a course for practitioner of rural development in Peru, in which they showed the autochthonous culture of the highlands or Amazonia as not being in the past, but as being for today and tomorrow, as an alternative, as a different way of being in the world. And I witnessed these professionals in the course, it's a graduate course, their transformation. It was the most moving, exciting thing. Instead of seeing, they would do they were asked to go home and do field work with their community and their parents. So they would talk to their parents or grandparents, depending on their age, and rediscover their own practices and their own customs in a completely new light. And it was a very exciting process. I did that for 10 years, and it really taught me a huge amount and showed me the upside of it, that it is possible. It is possible because it's not dead. These practices are not dead. These enactments are not dead. We just have to understand them in a I think it's very key to understand them in a non-specifically religious mode. Very important. Otherwise, you get accused, oh, you know, I mean, if you know, you are Christian or evangelical, you're being pagan, you know. You're worshipping idols if you're Jewish. Oh, this is a no-no, you know, or whatever. You know, you want to get out of that terrain. And that's why I really do the hard work I do to get out of that terrain. I try.
Understood. Thank you. Yeah? No, you have the microphone already.
Okay, hi. Thank you, Professor Marglin, for very honest and inspiring contribution. And honestly speaking, I don't have a question. I have rather comments. By the way, my name is Lenka Sobotová. I'm from the Czech Republic. And I would, by my comments, rather challenge the labeling mark, which is usually put in maybe you are facing it like saying it's romanticizing development and all these labeling.
Labeling what?
That romanticizing development.
Yes.
Because I think, well, it's my perception, but sometimes, or maybe mostly, it's linked with the indigenous, native, traditional, rural oriented research. But I would like to say that literally I have been experiencing what you have just described, and my research is basically in urban area. I'm researching cities. And in India, but not only, but my recent research is focused in India. And this is what I would like to add, that maybe it's a kind of another perspective how to perceive the romanticizing development if we can found or learned something. I'm still in the process, so I can't have answers. But if we can find it even in cities, in so-called slums or anywhere. So thank you.
Thank you for that. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's full in the cities. And it's also in the cities in the north, but it's totally marginalized. So it's not only in the global south, and certainly in India. Oh my God, I once was very Western and very modern. I needed an official paper, and I was in a line for an hour, and then I was the first one. I came very early, and I was in a big hurry. And the man behind took his time and first worshipped. This is in the heart of Calcutta, you know. Worship, you know, with incense, quietly did his mantra and all of this. And I had to cool my heels. Taught me a huge lesson. Huge, and you find it everywhere. So I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, here in front. There's two questions there.
Well, thanks first of all for a very fundamental opening of this conference. I really enjoyed it. I'm still trying to kind of wrap my mind about it. So my question is more of a clarification question, I guess, because I felt at some point that it sounded like you were using the natural sciences in a way kind of to validate or prove something that is not, in many cases, very surprising to social scientists. And I mean this distinction between, this artificiality of the distinction between object and the agencies of objectification. And I notice this because I have a lot of discussions with my brother who's doing applied physics. And I feel, in my experience, it's often the other way around, that this logic of that you cannot really make this distinction goes from the social sciences to the natural sciences. And here I felt you were kind of reinforcing the premise maybe of the natural science to kind of prove, yes, we're not crazy of thinking that. So I just wanted to hear a little bit more on how you see this and how I should contextualize that relation or that debate, basically.
Thank you. Thank you. I think actually agential realism is very new. That's total breakthrough. Karin Barad's work is a real breakthrough. You know, the idea that there is no nature out there. The implications of that are huge. It means there is no universal knowledge, no possibility of universal knowledge. Imagine that. The dominance of the West and the Western paradigm is based on that. So that's very new, and her work has been hailed as a breakthrough since it was published. So I would question that this is not new. I think it's very, very new. Why I do it, because of its, for me, what seduced me when I was a very close friend with Karin Barad. She would describe the Gedanken experiments that were carried out, and my jaw dropped. I said, this is so amazing. You can prove it, you can show it experimentally that the dominant paradigm is wrong. I was totally taken and seduced by that. But also, so that's my personal story, but I have been making this kind of critiques, as Wendy mentioned, for a very, very long time. And it didn't work. It doesn't work. So I really had to go to the core. I had to do something that Steve did for economics. I had to do it for social sciences in general. I had to go to the core. Where does it all come from? And address that. To try. I don't think it's effective. I think it's political, that people don't want to hear you, they don't hear you. Period. But for my own satisfaction, I had to do it. I've done it. I don't want to do it again. I don't want to do it again. I want to, in the future, write from my right brain and from my experience and from the heart. But I did, I wanted to try. So this is my effort. And I do disagree with you. I think the agential realism is really doing something very, very new. It's certainly been received that way.
Yeah. You agree? I mean, you were referring to the discussions with your brother.
Wrapping my mind around it, it's definitely something I
want
to.
You want to read Karin Barad's book, Meeting the Universe Halfway.
For sure.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So your turn.
Okay, I also want to thank you very much for this very inspirational talk, and also because I identified a bit with a lot of things you said, because I did my research on the role of emotions and embodied knowledges in participatory development, more specifically with poor young people in San Salvador. And so you talked now a bit about the importance of experiential and embodied learning for you and how did it transform you. But could you also comment a bit on the role of embodied and experiential learning in facilitating processes of development and change on larger scales? And how you see this, because that's something
it's a bit like Professor Sally's question.
I kind of struggle with for myself, so I would really like some answers.
Well, I will simply say that academia is probably the least fertile soil to do this in, from my experience, 30 years experience in academia, mainstream academia. And the more elite, the more infertile it is. But it is happening, and this goes back to the first comment, it is happening in different, the one that I have heard a lot about is in the empresarial, the business world. They are doing things and they are hiring for their businesses, they are hiring consultants. And they're doing workshops where you do body and feeling and stuff like that, which has yet to really be accepted in academia, but it's happening in many, and there are kind of gurus. I forgot the name now, I can't bring it to my mind immediately. There's a guy at MIT who has written about that. And I have friends who are these consultants who lead these workshops for businesses. And I've even heard that it's beginning among lawyers, believe it or not. They need it very badly. So I see if the change is going to happen, it's not the vanguard. I mean, there's a lot of very good work happening by academics, intellectual, but by itself, it's not going to do the job. I am convinced, because it needs enactment. I mean, this is exactly what I'm talking about. It needs doing, performing, and that's a whole holistic endeavor, and that's not academic territory. So I think, but it's happening in islands, and all I can hope is that it spreads and grows and begins to affect how I am, of course, given what I do at my center, I'm particularly, because it's in my face every day there, that these rituals are considered primitive, backward, superstitious. That's the dominant culture in Peru, not only in Lamas, but throughout the nation. And this is, I believe, in India it's different. It's less severe, but it's still fairly dominant, this view, oh, this is in the past. So that attitude needs to be changed. Needs to be changed, because that's where the hope is in these so-called superstitious backward practices, or learning from them. We don't need to do that way, but learning something from them, something essential.
Yes, I'm getting very strong signals from our conveners that we need to finalize the discussion. We have room for one more question. Thank you very much. Yeah, well, and already Rosalba was pointing me to the fact that I've had only women at the posing questions, so Johan Hatting may well make up for that, both male and
older.
I'll introduce you to Professor.
Yeah. Very briefly, this is not directly linked to my PhD, but I'm a physician, and I've been looking at alternative forms of healing. Yes, and I'll make it very brief. I think one cannot use the tools of evaluation of one to evaluate the other. Because, for instance, if one takes yoga, there are the way yoga looks at the body structure, anatomy in modern medical science does not. So I've had this thing of that, but that doesn't exist in my body, but I've experienced it. So I think if we start looking at one system of knowledge with the tools of the other, I think it would be problematic. And I mean, I thought you were trying to do it, and I thought it may not work. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I don't think I was doing that at all. What I was doing is showing that the biomedical anatomy, that supposedly this is the way the body really is. My argument is, if you put it on medicine, the body, dominant medicine says, it is this, 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 and it's universal. It's not. The anatomy and the understanding of the body by biomedicine is one way, through the assumptions of modernity, modern science. And if you say it is the way and it is universal, you make the yogic body a local knowledge at best and a superstition at worst. So this is precisely what I'm doing. I'm doing what I'm doing so as to shrink the claim of the dominant system, in this case biomedicine, to being a local knowledge. A particular take on reality of the body in this case. And yoga is another. And so I want to, what I am doing is attacking the universalistic claim as the real body is what anatomy of biomedicine tells us it is. No, that is imperialistic. And that makes the yogic body or any other body, the shamanic body, into local knowledge at best, or wrong knowledge at worst. And I want to put them on the same plane. Okay, so it's not at all what you're saying.
Thank you very much. So there is time for one short question.
Okay, thank you very much. One last question from maybe the older generation turning with grayer hair.
Well, young of spirit, I still hope.
I come from the global south and also from conventional academia. But sometimes I have the privilege to go into an institute to teach very much along the lines of what you've been talking about today. And I know of the challenges to talk to master students, doctoral students, and to try to convey what you have very eloquently started to articulate. But can I hear from you and from your side, if you were to place yourself in the position of a teacher and would like to teach a module on what you, and have to speak to master students and doctoral students, not so much what you will tell them, but how will you approach it? What would be your approach and through that, of course, the content of your teaching? Because I share with you the point that conventional academia can be very barren, but I hope it can also be very exciting to lecturers as well as to students.
I agree. I agree. I totally agree. And actually, this interest this focus on science began when I was lecturing in the Pratek course in Lima as a guest lecturer for 10 years. And it became clear that for the participants who were graduate students, therefore they had done so many years of education up to the BA, at least, they needed, what was very effective for them was precisely critique of classical science. It was very, very effective and very liberating. And it's exactly what they wanted and needed to fully go into this big transformation of seeing their parents or grandparents' practices not as archaic and primitive, but as an alternative, a viable alternative for today and tomorrow. Now, teaching, I taught in a college, therefore only at the BA level, only undergraduates. It's much harder to teach in America that stuff. I used to teach a course at Smith called Gender, Culture and Science, in which I did all this deconstruction of classical science. And when I first taught it, at one point when the students, all of a sudden they got it, I had a riot in the classroom. I had a riot. They began talking everything. But what am I going to do? I'm preparing to be a nurse. I want to be a doctor. You ruined everything. It was a disaster. And that taught me a lesson. I said, I have to be very careful. I don't want to... This is too potent, you know. I don't want to make them desperate, and they have to have a career. They have to, you know. And then I began to tone down and go slow and, you know, feel the students where they're at and adjust, because, you know, you can't... I mean, you know, it was one thing in Peru, that's exactly what they needed and wanted. And the, you know, Smith is to make their graduate to be as successful as the Harvard graduate, you know, that was the idea of Smith, it still is. And you're not going to be successful in American society with these ideas. So it's a very different task. So it depends who your students are, what level they're at, where they come from, what their prospects are. It takes sensitivity, diplomacy.
Well, that is not necessarily a negative connotation, I would say. Thank you very much, Professor Apfel. I'm sure that you did not destroy the academic careers of our PhD researchers here in the room. You gave them food for thought, additional food for thought. Thank you very much for doing it. Thank you very much for doing that in a very precise way you tried to formulate. I think that is very important. The way you took time to make us understand your argument. Thank you very much for doing that. Thank you, Rosalba, Wendy, and Mohammed for kicking off the discussion. Thank you for the lively debate. And perhaps Tamara has some organizational
Yes, I would like, if you don't mind, for you to remain seated for 3 minutes at least. And don't worry, we are actually live tweeting this conference, and we are tweeting it in a very positive way. So you don't need to worry about that. And let us thank Professor Frederik Apfel-Marglin for providing us with, you know, like opens up a new horizon for us here, PhD students. And it very fits to our theme, which is knowledges for equity and social justice. And by acknowledging these other practices as part of our knowledges, then we can contribute for social justice, I believe. And we also would like to thank Professor Dahan, Dr. Rosalba Icaza, Dr. Wendy Harcourt, and Professor Mohammed Salih for participating in this discussion, and to all of you who attended this seminar and also participate in the discussions. I have a little bit of announcement. We would swap the panel of conflict and peace to 3:45 to 5:45, the same room. And then challenges to development would be from 2 o'clock to 3:30 in the same room. You would find the program in your bag. And please, during the lunchtime, could you please register for the panels that you want to attend? The registration forms are outside at the registration desk. Thank you, and we would like to give some appreciation gifts, little gifts for our keynote speakers, our moderator, and our panelists. Thank you.